The Last Sunrise final scene explained. Does Rai remember everything? Hello everyone. Today we're going to explain the final scene of The Last Sunrise and answer the question that has been confusing viewers since the movie ended. Does Rai remember Julian, or does she forget everything after the surgery? Before we continue, here's your spoiler alert. We're going straight into the ending. Rai's surgery, her memories, Julian's final appearance, and what that last beach scene really means. So, let's start with what happens to Rai. After Rai's condition becomes increasingly dangerous, she eventually loses consciousness while she's with Julian on the beach. Her mother, Isolde, is forced to make a decision about the surgery Rai had been trying to avoid. Rai had previously refused the operation because there was a serious risk that it could affect her memory. And that fear wasn't minor. Rai isn't simply worried about forgetting random events from her childhood. She's afraid of losing the memories that make her life feel like her own. That now includes Julian. Their entire summer together has become one of the most important experiences of her life. So, when the doctors decide that surgery is necessary, there are really two things at stake. Rai could lose her life if she doesn't get treatment. But if she gets the surgery, she could survive while losing some of the memories she desperately wants to keep. Julian understands how much this scares her, but he ultimately encourages Isolde to allow the operation. His reasoning is incredibly important. He tells her that Rai's favorite memories can still be the ones ahead of her. In other words, Julian is choosing Rai's future over his own fear of being forgotten. The surgery goes ahead, and Rai survives. But then comes the moment we've been waiting for. Rai wakes up in the hospital. Julian enters the room. He sees her, and he says her name. Rai looks at him. But before we can clearly see whether she recognizes him, the movie cuts away. And this is where the film deliberately creates uncertainty. If the movie wanted to give us a straightforward answer, it could have shown Rai smiling and immediately saying Julian's name. But it doesn't. Instead, we're taken to another scene. Rai is swimming in the ocean, and we hear her voice describing what is happening inside her mind. She says that her memories are coming back to her one by one. That line is probably the biggest clue in the entire ending, because it tells us that the memories haven't necessarily disappeared forever. They're returning gradually. Rai can feel the past coming back. She remembers someone. She feels as though she could reach out and touch him. But she describes him almost like someone from another life. And that leads directly into the final moment. Julian approaches Rai on the beach. He looks at her, and instead of assuming she remembers him, he introduces himself. Hola, I'm Julian. And then the movie ends. So, does Rai remember everything? The honest answer is, the movie does not definitively tell us. Director Carlson Young has specifically said that the question is meant to remain open to interpretation. The ending was designed to create debate over whether Rai fully remembers Julian, and that makes the final scene much more interesting. There are two main ways to interpret it. The first interpretation is that Rai has forgotten Julian. The surgery affected her memories, and when Julian approaches her, she doesn't recognize him. That's why he introduces himself. If this is what happened, then the ending becomes bittersweet. Julian knows exactly who she is. He remembers their entire relationship. But Rai doesn't. And instead of walking away, Julian decides to meet her again. He essentially gives her another first meeting. That interpretation makes the final scene about love surviving even when memory doesn't. But there's another interpretation. Rai may actually remember Julian. The final scene could simply be recreating the moment when they first met. Remember, the movie deliberately mirrors their earlier beach encounter. The first time Julian and Rai met, they didn't know what their relationship would become. Now they've already experienced everything together. So Julian introducing himself again could be playful, symbolic, or even part of their way of reconnecting. And Rai's smile is important. She doesn't look frightened, she doesn't reject him, she doesn't appear confused in a way that tells us everything is gone. Instead, she smiles. That leaves room for the possibility that she knows exactly who is standing in front of her. There's another important clue. Rai tells us that her memories are coming back. That means even if she didn't immediately remember Julian when she woke up, it doesn't mean she'll never remember him. The movie establishes that memory is returning gradually. So the final scene could represent the beginning of that process rather than the conclusion. Maybe she remembers him moments later. Maybe she remembers him through a particular smell, place, voice, or feeling. Or maybe she remembers the relationship emotionally before she can remember all the details. And that actually fits the movie's larger message. The Last Sunrise isn't really about whether Rai can perfectly preserve every memory. It's about learning to live despite uncertainty. For much of the movie, Rai is terrified of losing control over her future. Her illness controls her, medication controls her routine, her mother tries to protect her, and the possibility of surgery threatens her memories. Rai wants to experience life on her own terms. That's why she stops taking her medication. She wants to feel everything. She wants to experience love. She wants to experience freedom. And Julian becomes the person who helps her understand that life isn't about controlling every possible outcome. Sometimes you have to accept uncertainty. That's exactly what the ending represents. Rai survives, but she doesn't receive a perfectly explained future. She doesn't wake up with every answer. Instead, she gets another chance, another sunrise, another day, another opportunity to create memories, and potentially another opportunity to fall in love with Julian. That's why the title becomes especially meaningful. At the beginning, Rai believes that her illness might make this her final summer. The phrase "last sunrise" sounds almost like a countdown. She thinks she has to experience everything because she doesn't know how much time she has left. But the ending completely changes the meaning. The sunrise isn't necessarily her last, it's the beginning of something new. The movie even uses Rai's voiceover to reinforce that idea. What she once thought would be her final summer becomes the beginning of her life. That's a huge emotional transformation. Earlier, Rai was living as though every beautiful moment might be a goodbye. Now she has survived long enough to experience whatever comes next, and Julian is still there. That's probably the most important part of the final scene. Even if Rai's memories aren't completely restored, Julian hasn't abandoned her. He's willing to introduce himself again. He's willing to start over. He's willing to let her discover him again instead of demanding that she remembers. And that gives the ending a surprisingly hopeful feeling. It's also worth mentioning that the movie's ending differs from Anna Todd's novel. The book gives a much clearer resolution, with Rai remembering Julian after the surgery and the couple remaining together in a later epilogue. The movie deliberately chooses a more ambiguous ending instead. So if you've read the book and expected the movie to simply confirm that Rai remembers Julian, that's why the final scene may feel confusing. The filmmakers wanted the audience to make that decision for themselves. And honestly, that ambiguity makes the final moment more powerful. Because the question isn't really just, does Rai remember Julian? The deeper question is, what happens if she doesn't? Would Julian still choose her? Would they fall in love again? Would their connection somehow return? The movie suggests that the answer could be yes. And that's why Julian's final introduction is so meaningful. He doesn't say, "You remember me, right?" He doesn't demand anything from her. He simply says who he is. "I'm Julian." It's almost like he's saying, we can start here. We can begin again. And if the memories return, we'll have those too. If they don't, we'll make new ones. That's a beautiful way to end the story. So, does Rai remember everything? The movie intentionally leaves that unanswered. She survives the surgery. Her memories begin returning. She appears to remember pieces of her past. And the final encounter with Julian strongly suggests that their connection isn't over. Whether she recognizes him immediately or has to rediscover him is left for us to decide. But either interpretation leads to the same emotional conclusion. Rai gets another chance at life, and Julian is still willing to be part of it. The final sunrise, therefore, isn't a goodbye. It's a beginning. A beginning where Rai can create new memories, recover old ones, and perhaps fall in love with Julian all over again. And maybe that's exactly what the movie wants us to take away. You can't always control what you lose. You can't always protect every memory. And you can't know exactly what the future will bring. But you can still choose to live. And after everything Rai has gone through, that is what the final sunrise represents. Not the end of her story, the beginning of her life.